I'm Henry Seltzer, and I'm a pretty well-known astrologer. My greatest claim to fame is that I created the interpretations for the Time Passages astrology software that's become very popular because it reveals a lot about what astrology has to tell you about your chart. So for beginners, it's very great, and also even for professionals, gives them a lot of information that they need. It runs on mobile platforms and also on both desktops, Mac, and Windows. And I've also been researching new planets beyond Pluto, and that's really the topic of this discussion today, which I want to frame in the context of where the society is heading. Where are we, and how can we get to be in a better place? So let me show you the slide, the PowerPoint. So this is the top topic. The title of my talk is New Paradigms. New Paradigm Cosmology Through the Acceptance of Astrology. And in this, I want to indicate that although my work has become commercially viable, that really wasn't the purpose of my creating the Time Passages software. The reason I did it was because I thought that the awareness of astrology would be a game changer in terms of consciousness, that it brings a mystical viewpoint right into our ken, so to speak, to make immediately available to us, because the evidence is there when you look into it that astrology really does work, and that's, as I say, by digging into it, by understanding more about it. The evidence presents itself, that somehow it works. And then what I love to say is astrology can't possibly work, and that's according to the current paradigm, the way our society in general regards, not so much. There are so many people that really understand that astrology is so important, that astrology works, that we have a mystical universe, that we really have a spiritual universe that we live within. But I believe that the vast majority of the population has yet to make some of those realizations, and I think it's so important. I think that astrology can help. So it's a mystical awareness that begins to emerge as a counter to materialism, which is what we have going. And I think it's because we have lost a lot of the old ways. The fundamental religions of whatever stripe hold little sway anymore. People don't seem to respond to it except by paying lip service to it. There was that mystical spiritual outlook that used to be involved in that way of being with the old religions, but in this 21st century, let's say, or towards the end of the 20th century as well, it was not really happening. It was attenuated, and so we need something to try to replace that. And I think it's important to realize also that you can't really legislate morality. As many laws as we make to try to regulate the corporations or whatever, we find that they can find ways around them, or it can be in the enforcement of the laws. So, the point is, we need the increase in consciousness, I believe, to be able to go towards a future that's really tenable for us. And let me go to the next slide. So here's the point that I'm trying to make, that astrology actually works, that's a miracle, and we don't know how it can work. I'm very fond of saying astrology can't possibly work, and yet it does. So that as we head into the heart of this 21st century, what we need are new models of spirit to take us through, and the society needs to evolve, and that we all probably realize that on some level, and we're all working for that in some way, I think. But that's my contribution, is that astrology can lead the way to something. And what new planetary archetypes also can tell us, because I've been researching these new planets beyond Pluto that have just been discovered in this century. And what can they tell us about where we're headed as a culture, because the planets that come along tell us something about the times that they are becoming prominent within. So that's going to be a very interesting point when I can get to that. So the first thing I'd like to bring forward is that it is a mystical or a symbolic or an archetypal truth that we find when we look into the way astrology works, because as this diagram slide here is trying to indicate, there is a mystical symbolic understanding of Venus when we look at the planet Venus in terms of astrological work, in terms of how does it connect with our own chart when it's transiting, how is it in our own natal chart to begin with, is it on the ascendant, on the midheaven, does it connect with other planets? And so, and when we say connect with other planets, we mean through the angles, through the squares or the trines, if it's exactly 90 degrees in the sky. And we'll get to that. I'll try to show that in a simple way so that we can work with that as these new planets are coming along. And I think it's very important to recognize that this is a symbolic level. In other words, it is the goddess of beauty, Aphrodite, Venus in the Roman transcription. And, how is that? It's amazing that the planet, the physical planet, somehow represents that. We just see it up there in our using astronomy, using our calculations. We know exactly where it is, and then we can see how it affects the chart that we're looking at. And then, by George, we find it in the personality. So we can either see it in the person and look for it in the chart, and then expect to find it and do, or we can actually look at it in the chart and then say, oh, you have these characteristics, I can tell. And it's not just feminine beauty, it's also aesthetics, it's also relationship. Those are the main things. And it is a sense of beauty. There is an intaking quality to Venus. And interestingly, Venus is within the orbit of the Earth and is more intaking and drawing toward herself rather than outgoing, which is more like Mars, which is on the outside of the orbit of the Earth. So these other characteristics of the planet do filter into the meaning of the planet as well. For example, Jupiter, always thought to be having to do with expansion, having to do with optimism, positivism, maybe even too positive, is also the largest planet when we actually look at the physical characteristics that we can find in this modern scientific age. Similarly, Saturn is the opposite of Jupiter. It's contracting. It's the ring past naught. It's the limitation. The ancients regarded it as the limit, and we in modern Western astrology also regard it as the limit of the physical world, and we're talking about transpersonal things when we get to Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, which are beyond that. Well, as it turns out, of course, when we had the telescopes, there were the rings. So the other question that comes up with these modern planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, is where does the name come from? Because people say, well, gee, that's so amazing. Pluto was named by a school child. And then it does turn out to have so much to do with Hades, the god of the underworld in those days, in the Greek times. And so how does that come about? And we have to just recognize that it is a synchronicity, that somehow it's all meant to be, that the name that's chosen and the name that's adopted by the vast population and the symbol that's chosen to recognize it with also, they all have something to do with this cosmic connection to the meaning of the planet. So that's really interesting as well. And speaking of synchronicity, I'd like to bring up that Carl Jung, thought about it for years and published this principle of synchronicity, which he called an acausal connecting principle. And he used an example, and he wrote that, by the way, with Wolfgang Pauli, who was a modern physicist, quantum physicist. And, this idea that there was a connection between things really came to him early in life from his experiences growing up in rural Switzerland. He gives the example of a flock of birds over a death house. Now, interestingly, there's no way that the flock of birds could be causing the death. Or it's no way that the death could somehow attract the birds, and yet they would see that correspondence. So I think it's quite interesting. And that was what he termed just an acausal connection principle, and it really is a mystical connection. And of course, we've all experienced it. You're thinking about somebody and the phone rings. So it's a kind of a principle that can be enunciated, but still not very well understood how this really happens, how these synchronicities and these astrological correspondences take place, archetypal correspondences, how they take place. And of course, modern physics also is a kind of a mystical thing. You know, Fritjof Capra wrote The Tao of Physics, talking about how there was such a similarity between modern physics and Eastern mystical realizations. And he talks about that correspondence, and he went on to talk about the web of life and seeing things from an organic perspective, from a systems theory viewpoint. And that's quite interesting, and I've looked into that a little bit in connection to some of these modern planets in terms of their archetypes, because they do apply in that way. And just to say, I think systems theory proposes that the things and the systems of this world cannot be broken down into their parts for analysis, but really must be looked at as an integration of the parts, the total interdependence of everything, which is very much like nature, of course. So at this point, I'd like to present some concrete evidence for the subject matter of astrology based on discoveries, new astronomical discoveries from this century. And the idea is, can we see if these correspond in the same way to some of the older discoveries, although still in the modern era, from the 1700s, 1800s, and the 1930 was when Pluto was discovered and named, and then of course became a very important part of Western astrology subsequent to that. So I was looking at these new ones, and I'd like to show you a little bit about my research. So the ones that I'm talking about, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, are in the modern era, but these are the three discovered in the 21st century, Haumea, Makemake, and Eris. And you can see these orbits. Let me see if I can show you with the mouse. Here in the bright blue you see Neptune, and that's a very circular orbit, as it turns out, and it's not very eccentric. These other ones are more eccentric, including Pluto, and they're located in the Kuiper belt beyond the beginning of the 8 planets that we start with. And here this dark blue is Pluto, and then here, and these two that are green and purple, Haumea and Makemake. And then you can see that Eris is actually the furthest out. So that as the planets were discovered, and then they're always further and always further, Pluto was an orbital period of 248 years, and then Eris is 559, so it really doubles, which is kind of appropriate. So I right away, and of course it's more prominent than Pluto in the Kuiper belt as well. It's brighter and more dense, about the same size, with one moon like Pluto has. So I was convinced that there would be something to it, and I began with the idea that it was a feminine warrior because it was the sister of the god of war, Eris, called the goddess of chaos and discord, but also the Greeks were describing their world, and chaos follows war. And she followed the god of war willingly into the battle and delighted in the groans of the dying. So I saw a feminine warrior, and I wondered how a feminine warrior would differ from a masculine warrior. And of course, the fact that it's a dwarf planet doesn't change the fact Pluto is also considered a dwarf planet. I prefer the term KBO planet because I think they were trying to say that we can't take these into account in our cosmology. It is the case that really our place in the universe with the solar system is a very important part of who we think we are, where we are. We understand that we're on this earth, and we understand that we're in the solar system. And I believe that the the astronomers felt like they were the keepers of the keys on how this really feels to everybody, and they didn't want the number of planets in the solar system to keep going up and up and up, 12 this year, 15 next year, 2 years down the road, another 20, it's 25 now. So they wanted to keep a lid on that, and it was a political move. There's really no reason to say that Pluto isn't a planet. You know, I mean, it goes around the sun, and it's circular. It has enough size and gravity to make itself into a sphere. But they came up with a category that would make these ones in the Kuiper belt a different category. That's why I prefer to call them KBO planets, because to me they are just simply planets. Although, of course, there's so many, we have to distinguish a little bit how we regard them. And the fact of the matter is, these are the 4 largest planets. That is to say, Pluto, Eris, Haumea, and Makemake are the 4 largest. So here's the book I wrote called The 10th Planet. And the point I was trying to get to there was, just as Pluto itself is the 9th planet, Eris is the 10th planet in that sense. and just a planet, you know. And then the idea being that we should be able to find a meaning for it in astrology work. And I thought about a feminine warrior and how would that be different from a masculine warrior that might fight for any old reason. And I came up, you know, for greed or for gold or for mercenary or for ego or for I'm bigger than you. But a feminine warrior I felt would be for deep purpose. And then I actually started looking at the feminist leaders of the past 200 years. I could not find one that did not have strong Eris in their charts. And also I wound up looking also at paradigm shifters that bring a new kind of way of looking into being. And that was, to me, a very good indication as well, that Eris was not just simply some kind of chaos, some kind of disruptor, although it's been thought of that way from its name of its goddess of chaos and discord, but that it was rather, it had a really positive side to it. And these people, when they find themselves, can be very important towards opening up new vistas and being able to work just strictly from their own lights, from their own way of looking at things, period. And I've confirmed this with research, of course. That's hundreds of charts I've looked at. So these planets, including Eris, including Pluto, go to depth. And the chaos and violent behavior that is possible when a person's bottom line values are not understood is part of the thing with also with Pluto. And as I said, feminists and paradigm shifters are good examples of how it can be a positive thing as well. Although there can be a fight, you know, some of these feminist leaders were very strong in what they brought forward. So what I say is that you find what your deepest values are, what you cannot not do, and you become an advocate for those deeper and more profound values. And you have to take your stand. And so I also say to be added to what we always say in astrology, as above, so below, is another which, as farthest out, so deepest within in terms of psychological astrology. So deep within the psyche, which is also Pluto, which was associated with the soul in some of the research, and it does go to depth in terms of compulsions and drives that we have to really dig into to find out what they are within us. And in the case of Eris, supports soul purpose as well. So I wanted to show you a couple examples of paradigm shifters. I'm going to show you some charts, and I'm hoping it's not beyond what you can absorb from, I know you're not all astrologers, so let's look at the chart of Einstein and see what we can see. So here's the diagram of the astrology chart, and it looks confusing and complicated if you're not used to it. All we're looking at, though, is a 360-degree circle divided into equal parts of 30 degrees each, which correspond to the 12 signs. And they do also represent the constellations at the time of the beginning of the just at the end of BC, the beginning of the Christian era. So that the constellations don't completely match up with the tropical signs anymore, which is a big story, of course, but that's due to the precession of the equinoxes, and we still associate the beginning of Aries with the beginning of spring, and that's why it's a little bit off from where the constellation was 2,000 years ago. And what we have here is you can see behind the planets and behind the houses, these are called the 12 houses. And in fact, this is the first house here, which is corresponding to the ascendant. So this is the ascendant and descendant. Everything here is above the horizon. Everything here is below, on the other side is below the horizon. And we have also the planets, and I've just indicated only the aspects to Eris, which this is the planet Eris. And this is actually the glyph that was designed by myself and my son, who's a graphic artist. And it represents, incidentally, to mention this, it represents going to depth. You can see it's a little arrow going down, similar to, losing that, okay, similar to the glyph of Venus and Mars combined, because it was the sister of the god of war, Mars. And also the small circle is the same circle as in the Pluto glyph, which you can see over here. So these are the glyphs of the planets. They're grouped in a certain concentration with Einstein. And this also indicates the aspects only to Eris. And you can see there's a very close aspect, because 14.5 degrees of Sag, this is the symbol for Sagittarius, And this is the symbol for Pisces, exactly 90 degrees, because this was also 14. So this is the kind of thing we look for in astrology. How close is that connection? Because closer, even if it was 16 or 18 degrees here, it would still be a square. But the fact that it's so close makes it stronger and more prominent. So we have a very strong connection between Eris and the moon. And I actually found with paradigm shifters, this is commonly the case. And if you think about it, the sun is more the rational basis of things, looking at cause and effect in terms of algebra that we can understand, or rationality that we can understand. The moon is more mystical. And I found that, I call it thinking outside the box, in terms of if it's Eris with the moon, Eris with Mars is different, Eris with these different planets is different. But thinking outside the box does correspond. People like Einstein, for example, he had all these thought experiments, like chasing a beam of light, what would happen? So he had a way of being almost magical and mystical in his thinking. And of course, being at the top of the chart like this, that's the 10th house, which is career, and he became the most easily recognizable scientist in the world, that shock of wild hair. So looking at just a couple more charts in this introductory part of chart work, here we have Isaac Newton. Here's all his aspects. Now, once again, you can notice that he has a very close connection, the same degree, 2 degrees of Cancer in this case, Eris and the moon. Well, okay, so this is another person that shifted the way we think about things. And in fact, when he published with the Royal Society, he published his astronomical work about the motions of the heavenly bodies. That turned out to be on an exact eclipse, same degree to his moon Eris. So I thought that was very interesting. Same thing happened with Einstein, by the way, in a different way. So looking at his individual aspects, it's interesting also to me that Eris is pretty well connected. You see exactly the same degree as Pluto, connected to Neptune in his chart, and connected by a trine also to Venus, so and opposite to the Sun. So these are the connections that we can see, and just a lot of connections, strong connections, and that's why I was able to show that there is a connection with paradigm shifters and with strong Eris. This is Copernicus. Once again, we can see, now this is actually the object of a yod from Pluto and Neptune, 150 degrees, very exact with Neptune. You see this is 18, this is 18 of different signs. This is Scorpio, this is Aries. So Eris in his chart was also very prominent, connected to some of his personal planets, connected to Saturn very precisely. So once again, and he was somebody that also, with the sun-centered system, completely overturned the thinking of his day, the philosophy of his day. And he didn't publish until he was on his deathbed, because the church had a completely different viewpoint. They thought that was ridiculous, that the sun could be the center. Everybody knows that the earth stood still when Joshua commanded it to stand. The sun, rather, stood still when Joshua commanded it. It's in the Bible. So the history of that was that was not accepted, as many new things are not accepted when they first come along. So once again, there's 3 of these that are prominent enough, and they are the largest of these Kuiper Belt objects. And we have to remember that these new planets do have a significance in chart work, and that significance is significant for our era. So it's a way of understanding our era. When Uranus was discovered, it was the late 1700s, and that corresponded to the revolutionary time period. There was the French Revolution and also the American Revolution at that time. And then we also had Neptune. The rise of spiritualism was perfect. 1850 was when Neptune was discovered and named, and also begun to understand as beyond, that it would go beyond this physical plane, that was about mystical, psychic correspondences, and then they started communicating with people that had passed over. So that was very appropriate as well. And then in the 1930s, Pluto was discovered in 1930 and named, and then we had the rise of Nazism. We had deep compulsions and obsessions that were coming forward. The racism was something we didn't understand, was just lurking right under the surface of the psyche. And then not only that, the atomic bomb, destructive power. Pluto is very powerful in terms of transformation, death and rebirth, destroying one way of seeing and opening up a new way, a new kind of life. So those were in the past, and then the curiosity would be, what about these planets coming in now? What would they have to tell us about what's going on in the society? And we, of course, we do see, what I'm leading up to is, of course, we do see the rise of the feminine, don't we? The Me Too movement and all the feminine or the women leaders right now too. It's a different world, isn't it? It's really changed quite a bit, that we have a lot more acceptance. The idea of a woman being in the home is just not part of our culture anymore, even though it was for hundreds of years. How do we investigate these new planets? So that's the question. Would they also be proven to be significant? Both of these planets, I thought it was very significant that they were named after indigenous gods and goddesses, the first officially named planets to be named such after, and indigenous societies are proving more and more important these days as well. So based on the idea of the indigenous societies, based on the idea that they represented nature in certain ways as creation god and goddess of these societies, I thought profound connection to nature, that was my first pass. And that did turn out to be able to be verified by research. So it's fascinating, the research. It keeps going on every day, new information comes in and keeps matching my assumptions that corresponds to the type of person that has a strong presence of these. So 21st century eras, Makemake and Haumea now, and there's a profound connection to nature. And then they also go to depth within the psyche, as we would expect, because they are so far out there. So not only connection to nature, but also to natural law, to right action and right relationship. There's an inherent moral compass with these people. They're truth tellers. And I think that's so important in today's world when we're facing that. People can lie, politicians can lie, and what's to stop them? You know, it's only a greater consciousness that's going to be able to make the right thing happen with people, because they can get away with anything. And with Haumea, there's a natural charisma from these kind of people. The love of nature is there, nature's creatures, the recognition that we're all creatures on this planet, that the planet itself has a spiritual presence. That's all part of it. And with Makemake, there's a greater sense of activism, I've found. That was by research that I was doing, that it seemed that those had a more prominent, Makemake had a more prominent sense of that, of activism. Whereas Haumea was more lovers of nature and having that philosophy of accepting that question of accepting other creatures as part of our own situation. And the orbital periods are interesting because Haumea is 284 years, Makemake is 306 years, so those are very similar time periods, and maybe that's why they're both in a very similar pattern as far as what they create in the charts. And as I was saying, they're the four largest objects in the Kuiper Belt. And here you get a sense of that. This is all compared to the moon. And then you can see Eris is considered actually the more prominent of the four. Then Pluto, then Haumea and Makemake. And then here's Ceres, because Ceres was also named a dwarf planet, but of course that's in the asteroid belt, and that's very well understood. And here's another comparison of the way they look, just the sizes of them. So I considered that it was a worthwhile study to study these four. Well, Pluto is already well understood, but to discover these three new ones, which were the other KBO planets. So the mythology of Haumea would be our starting point. And she was the creation goddess of the Hawaiian people. She had a magic wand that could make food appear in mimicry of the fertility of these islands. So, you know, there's food everywhere, and that's part of the idea of this creation goddess. She gave birth from many different parts of her body, her womb, her breasts, her hips, and then regenerated as a young woman again. So it's a representation of nature, the fecundity and the immutability, that is always giving forth new forms, always the same. And when we look at the physical planet itself, there's a question of shape-shifting that comes in, because it's not perfectly spherical, because it rotates so fast that it actually has an elongated shape. So I thought that was interesting too, because in terms of the fact that in the mythology, she's always kind of shifting and coming back to her original youthfulness. So I thought that was quite an interesting correspondence too. As far as Makemake, you had the Birdman cult. The Baki Baki is the creation god of the Rapa Nui people of Easter Island. And it's a fertility god in the Rapa Nui mythology. And of course, they built those incredible statues. There were 200 that were standing when they were first discovered by the Europeans. And there was another 600 in the quarry. And interestingly, they had lost all their trees for one reason or another. And one way of putting it is a kind of a story, which may not be the true story, that they cut down all their trees. And so that's one thing about connection to nature and also to environmentalists, remembering that it turns out to be a more activist. So environmental activists all seem to have strong maki-maki. And there is kind of a story you can tell that as we on this island Earth are running out of resources. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt was very famous for one of the early thinkers on this, that he set aside a lot of territory, including the valley, Yosemite Valley. And his motive was to save the resources. He said, when all the trees are gone, what are we going to do? When all the coal is gone, what are we going to do? And so he was after trying to preserve some of the resources. And he himself has maki-maki in perfect conjunction, same degree conjunction, with Eris at the top of the chart, which represents being in charge of the presidential function, the executive. So this Birdman cult, they would try to select, they would select the shaman or the Birdman for the year by a young champion would swim to a neighboring island and bring back the first egg of the season. And when he could climb the cliff, very tall cliff, so it was kind of a triathlon event, he would be the champion for an elder that would become the Birdman for that year until the next spring. And then I mentioned in this slide the environmental activism, because the island was denuded of trees by the time of European discovery, forcing a subsistence living because they could no longer build the canoes and go to fish. And they were fascinated when the Europeans arrived with the ships. The comments in the logs that have been saved from that period of time, they were measuring the ships. They would measure and look, and they couldn't believe the ships because they were a naval culture from their very earliest times. That's how they'd come to the island to begin with, several different waves of migration. And there's a picture of the way maki-maki looks. So what do I have to offer today is the Eris archetype. Here's the symbol for Eris. A feminine warrior, a warrior for sole purpose. Find where your deepest values lie and of what they consist, and then go for it. And that's the story of those with strong Eris. And then maki-maki, the profound connection to nature, and turns out to be more activist. And then the Haumea archetype, profound connection to nature, feminine goddess, creation goddess of the Hawaiian culture, and softer in approach, appreciator of the natural world, and celebrates the fecundity of life and has a certain charisma associated with them. This is what I've found with all my research. Now I'd like to show you some example charts, and I'm going to race through these but I think it's very interesting what they reveal. So Carl Jung, of course, he's a paradigm shifter par excellence. He brought new ways of seeing our psychology, our depth psychology, into being. And he has Eris very interestingly. I don't have Eris there, I have Haumea, but if you look at his Eris, which is right here, it connects by exact trine, 13 degrees of Cancer. And his Eris was in Pisces. So I should mention that Eris was in Pisces only until 1920, and then from 1920 onward it's been in Aries, and it takes the longest time to go through Aries because that's the furthest point of its orbit. So 559 years altogether, but it takes 120 years to go through Aries. That was a side note. And then the fact that he has Eris with Mercury is very interesting because, of course, he lectured in 3 languages. He was always writing. His collected works come to 18 volumes. And in the end of his life, he studied the spirit Mercurius as part of his alchemical studies. So that's fascinating to me, too. But the thing also about him is his Haumea is very prominent. So you can see that Haumea connects to his Sun, to Uranus, to Mars with a very close inconjunct or 150 degree aspect, and it's square Saturn, and it's between the moon and Jupiter. I'm sorry, the moon and Pluto, I meant. And so it conjunct Pluto and also not too far off from the moon. And that's again very indicative of more of a spiritual connection to things, with the moon being more mystical. And this is a great quote. So this is a quote from Jung. "It is the truth, a force of nature that expresses itself through me. I am only a channel. I can imagine in many instances where I would become sinister to you. For instance, if life had led you to take up an artificial attitude, then you wouldn't be able to stand me, because I am a natural being. By my very presence, I crystallize. I am a ferment. The unconscious of people who live in an artificial manner senses me as a danger. Everything about me irritates them, my way of speaking, my way of laughing. They sense nature." Isn't that great? So I love that quote, and kind of goes to the fact that he has such a strong Haumea in his chart. So here's another example. Friedrich von Schelling was a precursor of Jung. He was considered a nature philosopher. He said that the subjectivity of man is a part of nature. And so I was fascinated to see Haumea in his chart because of who he was, what he stood for. And it's all over his chart. You can see right here the connections it makes. We have his time of birth, and his Haumea was conjunct the moon, right at the front of the chart. And it also, it was at 6.5 degrees. His sun is at 7 degrees of Aquarius. Jupiter is at 7 degrees of Taurus, so square. And also Eris is at 7 degrees of Capricorn. And that opposition between Chiron, here at the bottom of the chart, this is Chiron, and Saturn is at 8 degrees. So it really closely connects, including, by the way, a quintile to Neptune at the top of the chart. So it's just a beautiful example of how strong Haumea was in his chart, and how I expected to find it because of his strong connection to that philosophy that our subjectivity is part of nature, he said. Now this is, of course, Ansel Adams, and such a beautiful photographer of nature. So I go to look at his chart, and sure enough I find that he had, here is Haumea right here, 0 degrees of Cancer. And his sun was 0 degrees of Pisces, so very close trine to the sun, also connected to Neptune, and also connected strongly to Mercury. And I have a slide for that too, that it turns out that Haumea connects to Mercury by a contraparallel as well as a trine, so it was a very close connection there too. So strong Haumea. It turns out also strong Makemake, because Makemake was all over the chart as well. And that surprised me until I read in his biography that he actually was an activist as well. Of course, we think of him as taking beautiful pictures of nature, but it turns out he was also an environmental activist, where he felt that nature was being encroached upon, the beauty of nature, by the activities of men. And he documented that in photography as well, which I had not realized. So there again is the activism. And here's Fritjof Capra. I was mentioning him. So all the systems theory people that I could find, like Gregory Bates and a bunch of other people, have very strong presence of these nature planets. In his case, you can see that Haumea is exactly opposite the sun. It connects to Venus as well. It connects to Saturn and Eris, and also Uranus. So, that's kind of a philosophical connection with Uranus and Saturn emphasized. And as I say, I've done, these are just the tip of the iceberg of hundreds of charts that I've looked at, and I keep finding what I'm looking for when I look for these connections to Haumea and Makemake. Joseph Campbell's a great example too. He was such an articulate spokesperson, and you can see in his chart, he has Jupiter, Mercury, the sun very close, within a degree practically, almost 6 degrees for all three, almost 6 degrees for the sun, and very close. So this is a very strong stellium of planets, and Haumea at 2 degrees of Cancer is exactly or not exactly, but is closely square, these planets, also conjunct Neptune. So Jaume is all over his chart, and the thing I found out researching that in his life was that he was very familiar with the flora and fauna of Pennsylvania. He had a mentor, and he knew how to name all the birds and things like that, and the plants, the flora and the fauna. And he also he went to the Wild West shows as a kid, and he was rooting for the Indians. And he started studying totem poles in the Museum of Natural History, and of course became familiar with all the indigenous societies and their mythology. That was his self-study that he did. And of course he has a strong Eris too. So the quote I have from him that I think is so beautiful, that does bring nature right into it, and he did say that mythology, the purpose of it was to connect man to nature. So the idea of profound connection to nature was really embedded in all of his work. And he has, I found this quote in the book that they made. There was a movie called The Hero's Journey, and then there's a book that came out from some of the transcripts of some of the discussions. They were at Esalen mostly. And so this is a quote in India talking about the path to spiritual connection. So in India, the elementary idea when the deity is recognized is called marga, which means path, from the root merg, which refers to the footprints left by an animal. So he says, and you follow that animal. The animal that you are trying to follow is your own spiritual self. And the path is indicated in the mythological images. Follow the tracks of the animal, and you will be led to the animal's home. Who is the animal? The animal is the human spirit. Where is its home? It's in your own heart. So following the elementary idea, you are led to your own deepest spiritual source. So you can see how he's all using the metaphor of nature to talk about the spiritual journey. This is a great chart for my purposes for showing these new planetary objects. Greta Thunberg, I knew she was a strong Eris just from her presence. Here she is speaking truth to power, not taking any shit from the world's leader, calling them out for what they're not taking care of for her generation and beyond, as far as environmental activism, as far as climate change. When we look at her chart, and here's the whole chart, we see that there's a very strong, there's a sextile between, this is Maki-Maki, between Maki-Maki and Mars, and that makes a yod to Eris. And not only that, it's a 19-degree Eris in her chart, 19 degrees, so it's a partile between a partile inconjunct between Maki-Maki and Eris. And then Eris is also very well aspected in her chart. Eris is in a grand trine with Pluto and Jupiter, so that's strong, and it also connects to the sun by square, and maybe the moon. We're not sure where the moon is because we have a sunrise chart here. We don't know her time of birth. And it connects as well to Uranus. So, strong lady, feminine warrior, speaking truth to power, wants to see things change. And she has this strong connection to Maki-Maki for environmental activism. So that was a good example chart. Came along after I'd already recognized that Maki-Maki was more the activist of the two. And here is also a very strong woman who's done a lot in the acting world, Scarlett Johansson. And here's her chart. And if we look, we can see that Maki-Maki is very strong in her chart. So that made me think of activism, and sure enough, I found out that she was doing some activist work. So this is her in the Women's March on Washington after the election of Trump. Rachel McAdams, by the way, another very charming person on screen, has strong both Jaume and Maki-Maki. Here you can see the Maki-Maki, 23 degrees, turns out to connect to both the sun and the moon very closely by sextile and by square. And then it turns out that she has this 17-degree thing going on with Mercury and Neptune, the same degree, 17 degrees of Sagittarius. And remember that these are 30-degree sections, 12 signs, 360 degrees all the way around, just to let you know what you're looking at here. And then it turns out, look, there's 17 degrees, her Jaume is 17 degrees, Pluto is 18, and Uranus is 17. So she has a very strong Haumea also, which I feel is a charisma that she demonstrates. And as far as the activism, she made a website called Green is Sexy, and here's some pictures of her doing her activist work. Joni Mitchell is such a fascinating example. She was somebody that, when you look, she does have a very strong connection of these new planets. In a grand trine, that is Maki Maki, in a grand trine with the sun and the moon. And if you think about it, and of course she also has strong Haumea. Haumea is exactly square the sun and makes some other aspects to the moon as well, of course, because it's 16 degrees. And then, so both of these planets, and it's just so fascinating, her poetry, her lyrics, and as far as activism, her whole life was activist, really, because what she was doing with her work was really bringing forward that understanding she had of the human condition and what we have inside and what's the truth and what's the truth of our behavior. And, many of the songs have a lot to say about the way we do things. Or I like to think about the Woodstock lyric also, by the time we got to Woodstock, we were 500,000 strong, and everywhere was a song and a celebration. And I dreamed I saw the bomber jet planes flying shotgun in the sky, turning into butterflies above our nation. So definitely has an activist mentality or personality, along with the beauty of her lyricism and her understanding of the depths of nature and the depths of human psychology. Then I wanted to mention also, this is Rutger Bregman, who wrote a book called Humankind, A Hopeful History. And his thesis in this is that the basis of human nature is kindness, and that we have the possibility of recognizing that he talks about how The Lord of the Flies was Goldman's conception. It was a fiction. The idea that we are basically, that teenagers left by themselves will start killing each other, which is the basis of that book. Instead, he cites, there was an incident, a great story. Teenagers from Tonga stole a boat because they wanted to go to Tahiti, and they got swept off course, and they were marooned for 15 months. And they actually had a very good connection with, that's what he reveals in this book, they had a very good connection with each other. And he cites it as an example that humans are basically kind and good. So I was interested for that reason in seeing his chart. And you can see that there's a grand trine in his chart with, we don't know where the moon is because this is not a chart we have the time for it, but it is Maki Maki in a grand trine with this beautiful Saturn-Uranus conjunction in Capricorns, grand trine in Earth, with also the sun at 6 degrees of Taurus. And I just thought that was so beautiful, because here he is being very active, trying to bring these ideas forward, that we have a basic kindness as the foundation. And when you think about kindness, I think that Jane Goodall is a beautiful example of a really wonderful human being, such a kind, beautiful person. And of course, she worked with the chimpanzees and recognized them as fellow creatures, that they had a society there, and that really you could think of them like humans. These are really fellow creatures on the planet. And when I looked at her chart, I wasn't surprised to find a strong presence of Haumea and a grand trine with Moon and with Eris. I think I have another slide showing, that you can see the grand trine here with Eris at 2 degrees, very close grand trine. And she also has a T-square between that position of Eris and her midheaven. We do have her time of birth. And also Maki Maki. So, and of course, this again, she has both of them, and it is really an activist career that she brought forward, because she's a wonderful example of what we can have when we have a culture of kindness that we can really respond to. So I like to use this as a symbol for what's happening in the culture these days. I thought that was a great title of a book, Strong as the New Pretty, thinking of Eris, of course. And this is the time passages software that I created that has all these planets with interpretations in them too, a way of exploring them for yourself and your own chart, either on the mobile platform or on the desktop. And so that's my presentation. I wanted to bring all this forward and to try to say that where we're heading as a culture really can be a culture of kindness. And that's something that we can really use as an optimistic belief. And that, by studying astrology and by understanding that astrology actually has something to tell us about ourselves, about our culture, about our interactions, about our other people too, and all that it brings forward, we recognize that there's a mystical part of this life. It's right there, right in front of us when we look at it. And I think that's a very inspiring thing as well. So I'm optimistic. I do believe that we can get there. I think we have a lot of reaction against it. You know, there's a lot of backlash that's going on. But I think we're basically on the right track. So that's what I wanted to share. I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. Well, now we've arranged a little question and answer session to see if we can get some more information on these new planets as I've been trying to present them here. And here is the orbits of those three new ones. And we have a question. Do we have a question?
Yeah, I have a question.
Oh, okay, good.
All right, well, first, just thank you so much for the presentation. And yes, and my question is right in line with this slide. So you're talking, it's just kind of summing up what I think I'm learning here, is that you're focusing on the Kuiper Belt and these four largest bodies in the Kuiper Belt.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you could just kind of sum up again how these four, including Pluto, are all this, like, have a similarity, and then how they're like distinctly a little bit different from each other.
Oh, I think that's a really good question. You know, I haven't been concentrating on Pluto very much because that's so well known in terms of astrology, the research that's already been done. I'm not really adding to that. I mean, I think it's in the years, almost a century now, since Pluto has been discovered, it's been really understood pretty well as going to depth within the psyche. You know, the book by Jeff Green is really classic in that sense, just called Pluto. And he was really going for how it was representing the soul. And, you know, he was very tuned in, very kind of psychically aware. And he said it really does go to depth within the psyche, and it represents our soul level. And I took a clue from there when I was starting to understand Eris better as a feminine warrior, how that differed from our concept of just warrior, and how that actually represented, too, a feminine warrior that really went to soul level. Because these planets all go to depth. You know, I mentioned that phrase, which I like that phrase, that just as we can say as above, so below, we can say so furthest out, so deepest within, applying to all four of these. And I do think that they all partake of that. Now, there is a connection, which I haven't really gone into great detail about, that Eris, it is soul level stuff. You know, it's what you cannot not do, in the sense that what you find you're really sort of meant for. You know, there's a way you can kind of tune into where you're actually supposed to be coming from. And even if you might be, you know, don't quit your day job yet, you're still kind of tuning into where that is. And you gradually, you know, it's separate. I always say that it's separate from consensus thinking. It's separate from early conditioning. It's separate from whatever you thought you were doing as you start your adult life, you know, because it takes a while to tune into it. But once you do, it's meaning. You find meaning in your life. And that's so important. And I also have associated it with this most recent 2020 time period when it was square, Eris was square to the Pluto-Saturn conjunction, which really heralded, people were talking about it, astrologers were talking about it before 2020. What was it going to be like? What kind of societal reset would we see? We knew that it was going to be Saturn and Pluto coming together, and Eris in square the whole time, and then eventually joined by Jupiter. So then it was a triple of Saturn, Pluto, and also Jupiter by November of 2020, which made me think initially, even before the year started, that would be a particularly intense time. And of course, that was after the 2020 election, when there was all this confusion and chaos about what was the result, and what was the lie and what was the truth about that. So that was a very powerful time. And then Eris was square the whole time. And the pandemic was what was characterizing that time period also, of course. And, what I always said about Eris, you have to find out what your position is. You have to stand up for yourself. You have to know where you stand, what you feel like. And everybody really, the pandemic was really up to everybody. The social distancing was up to every single individual to carry it out. The way that we had to decide how to deal with it, how to handle it, each in our own individual way, contributed entirely to the way the whole culture. So it was up to everybody, really, and I thought that was such an interesting take on the fact that Eris was square to that Pluto-Saturn conjunction the whole time. And then, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I wonder too. This is maybe a little controversial, but for some of us, the square in 2020 might also have heralded the beginning of a distrust in government.
I see where you're going with that, and I think it makes sense. There is, yes, that whole tendency, which affects different people different ways, but because people will find what is inside them, and they'll find a different reality from the next person, probably. Yes, that's a good point. That people had sort of a general a tendency to look for themselves and to try to see what's behind all this, as far as the whole handling the pandemic, which goes to the government handling it, goes to the Trump administration, it goes to also the whole question of vaccination later on. But in spite of those kind of political things, I do think that it's just a very strong energy in an individual chart, and I've got so many examples of that. And then also I wanted to mention, to answer your question about what do I see as the similarities. So I found that Haumea and Makemake, that I call it profound connection to nature, and the word profound is similar to the word depth. It has to do with coming from the deepest part of ourselves, and I think there's a way that these people that I found, and there's so many good examples of it that I didn't quote, Robert Redford, people, all kinds of people like that, they're just icons in a certain way. And what was true about Redford, which I found he had the very strong positions of Haumea, and I think Makemake as well in his chart, that, it comes from this deep place of just kind of, he was always about the truth of his performance as an actor, or when he was actually producing films too. What could he tell? How could he tell that story in a way that really got the truth of it? Which is really kind of the apex of the theater and film industry. Really, is going to the truth of the matter. And so you see it in actors quite a bit, actually, especially the ones that have that kind of base attitude, like I tried to show with a couple of the examples. Rachel McAdam. It's also Scarlett Johansson. People that are just kind of, they have that truth showing. It's kind of shining when they're in that film such situation. And I do find that Haumea and Makemake are similar in the way they come across. That there's sometimes I'd find Makemake when I was looking for Haumea. In other words, the connection to nature is there with both of them, and the connection to deep process that really emphasizes right action, right relationship, what is the truth of things. Don't let it get to your head, don't let it get away from you and become sort of a sense of aggrandizement or a sense of entitlement. It really does go to, there's a negative side to all these planets. Everything has a negative, all the astrological archetypes have a negative sense to them. But anyway, they do all have that in common, that I think they go to a very deep place, but they have slightly different ways that they go to that depth. So
that's helpful. That's helpful. Thank you. The word found, the word depth, and I love that when you said, so furthest out, so deepest within. And it seems, I don't know, in my mind, right on time that these kind of archetypes are coming back into our consciousness when we are understanding that if we don't return to our indigenuity as a species, we'll most likely go extinct ourselves.
It's time, isn't it? It really is time to look into what we can do, how we can manifest authenticity.
As you were sharing the presentation, I was excited when I saw you start to present the Greta for example, Thunberg and some of these women who have a gravitas, I noticed I was thinking about Angela Davis as somebody who, a profound mover and shaker, and I wondered if you have an example of someone like her.
Well,
women,
specifically,
feminist activists.
Specifically Angela Davis, I did look at her chart. In fact, she's in the book, the Iris book, and it's very interesting because she had this sextile between the Sun and Iris. It started as there was a trine between her natal Sun and Uranus in the chart, close trine, and that corresponds to her revolutionary stance. She's very clearly a revolutionary attitude. She wanted to see things change, and she was willing to try to be radical about it. Well, right at the midpoint of that trine between Sun and Uranus is the position of Iris at 4 degrees of Aries. So I thought that was very interesting, and it really kind of, when you know that Iris is as important as it is in charts, it really brings out the planet. I was trying to get into that with a couple of examples, but it just is over and over again, like there's so many examples of how Iris with that planet really brings that planet forward. But so that's why it sort of enhances your understanding when you see that Iris position, because it's one more part of the chart that you can really kind of look into, and it gives you more information. And in her case, it really emphasized that Sun Uranus, that it wasn't just that Sun Uranus trine, it was boom, really there, really part of her at depth. So that was, enlightening to me. And, people like Gloria Steinem has the conjunction Sun and Iris. And one of the astrologers that really picked up on my work immediately, I sent Alan Oken, dear Alan, who's passed now. I sent Alan the preliminary PDF so that he could look at it, and there's a review from him on the back of the book, of the 10th Planet book, and he has Sun Iris conjunct, and he took to it immediately. He was just right there. I see what you're doing here, and he really understood it, which was powerful feedback for me.
Nice. Yeah.
And I've got an example too. I have a friend that is into nature poetry as a poet. She writes. She's written 3 books, and about how a tree feels waking up. From the standpoint of nature. And I just wanted to see in her chart, and I said, "Oh my gosh, I really want to see where Haumea is in your chart." And she has the partile square between Mercury and Haumea to the minute. It wasn't even to the degree, to the minute. And a few examples like that. Another one is this woman that she makes Airbnbs out of tiny houses located in nature. So she started with a few, and then she got to more. And this is somebody I just read about. I think her name is Christy Wolf, and I was able to look at her chart. I was able to get her birth data. And she has, I don't have the time, but she has exact conjunction, partile conjunction between Venus and Haumea. And you see, she's kind of, even the decorations inside these tiny houses were of a nature theme, like bunny towel racks and stuff. So, I could see that nature was part of the way she did her kind of decorator mode, which was one way of looking at Venus. So that was perfect as well. So anyway, loads of examples. I just touched the surface of all the charts I've got for examples here.
Yeah, thanks.
So any more questions, or we have time for a brief one?
Here's my last question is, where are you excited to take this material next?
Well, I do feel kind of complete in the fact that these are the officially named planets, and the IAU, the Astronomers Union, has no real intention of adding to the list at the moment. They came out with this new designation of dwarf planet, said Pluto's in that category, and people were disappointed because Pluto was always part of the solar system, and now it's a little bit of a different angle on it, although astrologers keep using Pluto just the same. We have not changed anything about the way we view Pluto in charts, which gave me my clue for pursuing Eris and then these other 2. And these are, though, the only ones officially named, and there's no immediate plans to change that listing. So in that sense, I'm very satisfied. But that's a good question you raised, because I have thought that there's some other candidates out there that astrologers have been talking about in interesting ways. Varuna, Orcus, Quarar, a few. And I want to look into those. And so that is my next actual project, is to see what I can see in terms of any similarities to going to death within the psyche, similarities and differences with the ones that I've already identified. So that's where I'm going to take it next. So thanks for your questions, and then I think we'll just wrap it up. And I just want to say, again, thanks so much for watching, and I hope this was informative for where astrology could be headed in the future, and also for what it might have to share with us about what's coming up in our times. You know, these new ones really identifying that there's a way that we can each, it frees us up, you know, we can each take our stand, Eris, and we can vote for kindness with our actions, and we can tune into that as a real characteristic of this new century as it's developing, that there's a real thrust toward understanding indigenous peoples better, understanding the nature of the planet better, and the environmental concerns of the planet, working towards that, working towards really the good situation for all creatures here on the earth, and you know, and everywhere in the culture, and all people, and just realize that we can get there. We can get to a better place in the way we regard each other and the way we carry ourselves as a culture forward into the future. So thanks again for watching. Bye now.